Well, we have been working through the book of Genesis, and we've come to Genesis chapter 27, 28. Let me catch you up to where we are in the story. When we left last week, Jacob had manipulated his slightly older brother Esau out of his birthright by playing on Esau's impulsiveness, trading his birthright for a bowl of soup. And we talked about the HALT principle, that we're most vulnerable when we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, and Esau is going to fail that test. The covenant promise is going to run through the younger brother, Jacob, as God had intimated to his mother, Rebekah. The scene paints Jacob, though, not in the best light, does it? And in the next scene, now Jacob is going to concoct a scheme with his mother to get the father Isaac's blessing as well. Now, the blessing is not about material goods. It's really about the destiny of the son. And so in the context of this story in Genesis, the blessing is about who's going to carry this covenant promise of God forward. Jacob, the younger son, is going to do so, but he gains the blessing by nefarious means. And if you know that story, his mother gets him to put goat skins on his arms, and so that he smells and feels like Esau when he goes into the blessing. And Isaac is blind at this point and very old, and apparently not very bright either, because I hear the voice of my son Jacob, but I feel and smell Esau. And you're like, dude, come on, man. But he winds up giving the blessing to who he thinks is Esau, but it's actually Jacob. And in those days, those kinds of blessings were irrevocable. So he basically, Jacob steals the blessing. And the blessing is pretty significant. Isaac caught the smell of his clothes. This is chapter 27, beginning at verse 27. And he blessed him, and he said, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field the Lord has blessed. May God give you of heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. Sounds pretty good, right? Sounds like a phenomenal blessing that Jacob gets. Well, Esau soon returns from the field. And once again, he's a day late and a dollar short. He discovers that Jacob has stolen the blessing. Now, he begs Isaac for a blessing, and Isaac gives him a blessing as well, but it's quite different. Listen to this, beginning at verse 39 in chapter 27. His father Isaac said to him, your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck. Wow. Very different. Esau, impulsive though he may be, is furious about this, and his anger leads him to plot the murder of his brother Jacob. He thought to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, then I will kill my brother. Well, Rebekah, the mother, hears about this, and she tells Jacob to flee, to go back to Haran, where Abraham and Isaac's kin were from, and to stay there until Esau's anger had subsided, assuming that it would. Rebekah tells her husband Isaac that she's sending Jacob away to get a wife from among their own people. That seems to be the place to go to get a wife in Genesis, is to go back to Haran. It's like the wife store. I don't know what it is there. There's a well there. It's like the dating place. It's like the Tinder of ancient Israel. I don't know, something like that. That's where they get connected. And she's sending him there to stay with her brother Laban. So Rebekah's brother, Jacob's uncle, that's going to be where he's headed. But with that in mind, Isaac is going to bless Jacob once again, this time in a much more specific way related to the covenant promise of God. We've been tracking this all the way through. Listen to this, chapter 28, verse 3. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. May he give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now reside as a foreigner, the land God gave to Abraham. So the covenant is going to go through Jacob. But the question is he worth it? To this point, Jacob has not exactly been an example of godliness. In fact, he doesn't seem to have acknowledged God at all to this point in the story, in the same way that Abraham and Isaac had done. Jacob is a trickster. He's a supplanter, a usurper, a deal maker, a deceiver, a cheater. He doesn't deserve this blessing any more than Esau does, at least to this point in our way of thinking. But we have to remember, not only in this story, but throughout Genesis, and even throughout the Bible, God sees what we do not see. And because God is the one who's moving the covenant forward, he often chooses to do it through the least likely people. Why? Because that's where his power is most seen. And often the way God gets people's attention is by encountering them in their lowest moments. Now, it's hard to imagine Jacob being in a lower moment at this point. He's running for his life. He's faced with a 550-mile journey across the Fertile Crescent to his destination in Haran. Travel in the ancient world was a dangerous proposition, especially if you were traveling alone. The wilderness was harsh and unforgiving. Threats lay behind every turn, from snakes, wild animals, weather, bandits. It would be a journey of at least a month through this wilderness to get back to Haran. But it wasn't only a physical journey. For Jacob, it was also a spiritual journey. Cut off from his family, from his inheritance, he was alone. We have to imagine that he was hungry, that he was probably a little bit angry at the situation, perhaps even at himself. He was lonely, certainly, and tired. A long journey. In other words, he's at his most vulnerable. Now, we said last week that when we're in that space, that's where it's important for us to halt and to take stock, to avoid the rash decision, to avoid giving in to temptation. But there's another aspect to halting that this story brings to us. And that is that often when we're in that really vulnerable space, it's also the point at which God can get our attention. When we're stripped down of all the things we depend on, there's nothing left but God. And in that lonely space, God can speak if we're willing to listen. We might think of it as a wilderness time. And in the Bible, the wilderness always represents a time of preparation. Shedding the old, taking on the new. I mean, think about it. The book of Exodus, the children of Israel wander through the desert for 40 years before they get to the promised land. Jesus, when he's preparing to go into his public ministry, goes into the wilderness for 40 days, was tempted by Satan. That's a time of preparation for him. Jacob may have taken 40 days to make this journey. That's about how it would track if you were walking on foot. It's in these wilderness times, though, that God has the opportunity to speak. And so Jacob's about 60 miles into his journey from Beersheba, a tramp of several days, when darkness overtakes him and he decides to finally make camp for the night. And so he beds down using a stone for a pillow, which is a precursor to a good night of sleep, right? We're all set for that. That little detail tells us something about his state of mind, something to which we can all relate, I think. We've all known the sleepless night when we replay the trouble that we're in, the problem that we're facing, the difficult situation, the angry conflict that we argue over again and again. We toss and turn. And even that soft, downy pillow that we have on our bed can begin to feel like a rock underneath us. I mean, it's dark, it's lonely, it's vulnerable. Nighttime, everything seems worse than it actually is, doesn't it? Sleep is fitful when it comes at all. It's darkness that magnifies the despair. Feels like it's closing in. St. John of the Cross, who was a 16th century Christian mystic, called this the dark night of the soul. A feeling of distance, a feeling of deep loneliness. It's hitting rock bottom or a rock pillow, as the case may be. But it's in this space that the voice of God, the vision of God, can finally break through to us. And in Jacob's case, it comes in a dream. Now, we're seeing these repeated patterns here in Genesis, and dreams are another repeated pattern. We see this as a major part of the story. They're vehicles for what we might call theophanies, or revelations of God, communicating important truths through symbolic images. The Joseph story, which we're going to be diving into in detail during the Lenten season, is driven by dreams. But this dream of Jacob's represents his first encounter with God and the revelation of God's covenant promise that's going to come through him. So Jacob's dream is of a ladder or a stairway that reaches up to heaven. Now, okay, I know what you're thinking. You've got Led Zeppelin on your mind right now. At least if you're like me, that's what I think of every time I read this text. You've got Robert Plant in the background, all those kinds of things. Okay, put that aside for just a minute. Let's look at the symbol through the eyes of someone in the ancient Near East. We call it Jacob's ladder, but it was probably more like a ziggurat or a temple-like structure, a pyramid-like structure with stairs that go from the bottom to the top. And these stairs in the ancient world were designed for the gods to be able to descend and ascend with the people. So at the top of the ziggurat was where the gods supposedly would land, and in some of these ziggurats, they put a little apartment at the top of the ziggurat for the gods to come and dwell while they're down there on earth. And then at the bottom of the stairs, there would be a temple, and that's where the people could go and worship this god and offer sacrifices. When you think about a ziggurat, think about the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. Same kind of image is depicted there. So this is a common thing in the ancient world. But while it's a familiar thing, the Bible, of course, always offers a twist. In Jacob's vision, angels of God, divine messengers, were indeed ascending and descending, carrying out their tasks on earth and then reporting back to heaven. But in this case, God is not on the summit of the temple. Now, the NIV renders verse 13 as God standing above the stairway. That's what we read a little bit earlier. But the Hebrew actually more implies that God is standing beside Jacob, standing beside the stairway. In other words, God is not using this stairway himself, as the pagans would expect. Rather, God transcends it. It's a revelation of heaven, but God is firmly with Jacob on the earth. And that lends weight to what God says to Jacob in the dream. Look at verse 13 of chapter 28. He said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. So what does God tell Jacob? The covenant promise given to Abraham, the same promise, is now coming through him. And God will go with him on this journey. Jacob doesn't deserve it, doesn't seem to be the right candidate for it, but this is God's covenant. And God will carry it through. It's indicative that God's grace and favor isn't something we earn. It's a gift. And that gift of grace can then begin to shape us into the people God calls us to be. God starts with Jacob where he is. And he's going to move him forward. I think God does the same for us. Jacob gets a glimpse of what his life will be, a shining ray of hope in the midst of this dark night. Now, the journey is going to be long, as we'll see. It has lots of twists and turns to it. But God stands beside him. Just as God stands beside him in the dream, he says, I'll be with you all the way. Jacob's response to the dream is a revelation. He says, surely the Lord was in this place, and I did not know it. In the darkest, most vulnerable moment of his life, when it seemed that God was absent from the story, God was there. Of course, God had been there all along, but it took a wilderness moment, a dream in the midst of a dark and lonely night, to see it. Have you ever experienced something like this? That moment when God revealed himself to you in that dark night of the soul. I experienced my call to ministry in such a dark night. After college, I had wandered a bit from my faith. I was in the National Guard, and so I spent a lot of weekends out in the field. And I'd grown up in the church. I used to say, when I was a kid, I had a choice about whether I wanted to go to church or not. I could go happy or I could go sad. Those are my choices. But we were going. And in college, Jennifer and I met at a Campus Crusade for Christ meeting, and I did that dutifully. But once college was done, I kind of was an angry young man. And the U.S. Army knows what to do with angry young men. They point them in the right direction, teach them what to do with that. So we'd stop going to church. I was in the National Guard, which took up a lot of weekends, but I was also working at a radio station in State College. I was writing commercials and doing production. Back in the days when we had reel-to-reel tape and razor blades and vinyl records in the studio. And I loved that job. It was a great job. It was fun to do that, writing commercials. But on Friday the 13th of May, 1988, I think they picked that day on purpose, they automated the station and they fired all of us on the staff. This was a failure in my mind. I had built myself up to wanting to be something, and now here I was without a job. I remember coming home to our apartment and just weeping. And thankful for my wonderful wife who was there beside me the whole time and who helped me to kind of find what was next. But it was a low point, about as low as it gets. And I was in a very dark place, wondering where life was going. But because I had a secret security clearance through the Army, I got a job as a night watchman at a government contractor. Contractor made electronic warfare something or other for the Navy. I don't understand all that stuff. I was in the infantry, okay? We don't understand that stuff. But because I had a secret security clearance, my job was to go out at night through the entire office complex, 3 buildings worth of office complex, and to check every classified safe and cabinet to make sure that it was locked and that nobody was messing with classified materials. I was armed with a badge and a flashlight. And I remember saying to the supervisor, what happens if I come across some foreign agent breaking into one of these classified safes? And this is what he said. He said, you yell, stop. What if he doesn't stop? Then you yell, stop again. And you threaten him with your flashlight. Fortunately, I never ran into any foreign agents breaking into classified safes, but this was a dumb job. And you're walking around in the middle of the night by yourself, just weird. But God was in that place, and I did not know it. I was humbled, broken, hurting, but somehow walking around in the dark by myself, hour after hour, God began to work on me, drawing me back. There was no flash of light. There was no dream of a stairway to heaven, just a sense that God, whom I had neglected, was still walking beside me, calling me to a different way of being. So I began to use those dark nights for prayer as I walked. We went to church again, started going to a little Christian Missionary Alliance church. And a few months later, I saw an ad in the paper, which is a very old sentence. I saw an ad in the paper for a youth director at a United Methodist church. I don't know what prompted me to apply for this job. I mean, other than the fact that I had had a kind of a rough time growing up and I'd grown up in the church, I didn't have any qualifications for this job, other than the fact that I was still in the National Guard. So when I met with the pastor, he hired me on the spot. I think primarily because the group was mostly 7th grade boys. 7th grade boys and 19-year-old infantry privates, pretty much the same maturity level. So I think he figured if nothing else, things will be in order, okay? But it was there that I began to discover this call that God had been preparing me for. for years and years, and I did not know it. I don't know what would have happened without that dark night of the soul. Now, I'm not saying that's something we should go seek out. It shouldn't take a crisis for us to recognize God's presence and calling on our lives. Just like avoiding temptation, following God requires a daily discipline, focusing on our relationship with God. But we're in that vulnerable place when we all inevitably find ourselves there. You can relate. It's then that we need to be looking for, we need to be asking for God's revelation. James says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. That's the promise. Jacob got a glimpse of the unseen realm that surrounds us every day. That God is at work at every moment despite the circumstances. God is going to see Jacob through some tough times ahead, and he will see us through as well. I imagine that vision of the stairway sustained him all the way through. A promise that God would make everything right, that his covenant promise would go forward. And so Jacob, when he wakes up, he takes the rock that he had laid his head on and he sets it up as a pillar, a marker of the event. That was common in the ancient world. This morning in our traditional service, we're singing the great hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, where there's a line in there, here I raise my Ebenezer, and it never fails. Someone will ask me after worship, what is that? What is raising an Ebenezer? It's a standing stone. It's a rock. It's a marker of a significant event, a significant place, a monument, if you will. Those who walk with God recognize those marker points in life where God's revelation has moved them in a different direction. Sacred space can be anywhere, from the wilderness of Bethel. Notice Jacob calls it Bethel, house of God. Could be there in the wilderness. Could be in a cubicle farm in a government contractor. Doesn't matter. What matters is that God intends to dwell with us in his good creation. And when that's the case, every space can be sacred space. We mark those spaces, and like Jacob, we can return to them again and again, either in body or in spirit. Now, of course, Jacob's faith is still pretty fledgling at this point. In verse 20, he makes a vow. Listen to the vow. Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Now, Jacob seems to be cutting a deal here again, much like he did with Esau. If you follow through, God, then you'll be my God, and I'll give you a tenth of all my possessions. That's less a statement of faith than it is, let's make a deal. It's quite different from Abraham's faith. God calls Abraham, and Abraham went as the Lord told him. But it's a reminder to us that faith doesn't always come to us in a moment, that it often takes time to develop. And in fact, if we're honest, we're still learning and developing our faith all the way to the end of our lives. Those moments happen all along the way. That's the pursuit. That's the journey, trusting God and walking with him in the day-to-day, and especially in the wilderness times of our lives. Not only do we have to be mindful, but we also need to be anticipating what God might do. Reminds me again of Led Zeppelin. Robert Plant's lyric in the song, yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. I think that's true. Jesus himself would say that faith the size of a mustard seed is all you really need. We may not be the most qualified. We may not have the best past. We may not know the destination, but faith keeps moving. It keeps trusting, even in the dark night of the soul, knowing that God is present, that the stairway to and from heaven is not closed. God stands beside it, stands beside us, and his promises are true. So how does this story hit you today? Does it remind you of some of those other moments in your life? Some of you here today are right there in the middle of that dark night of the soul. In fact, maybe even last night, as you lay with your head on the pillow, it felt like a rock. In the midst of that darkness, it's easy to panic. But I want to encourage you today to listen for God. Remember that He's at work, that He's standing beside you. Lean on Him. Draw near to Him, and He will draw near to you. Or maybe you're in a good place right now. Celebrate that. Remember your standing stones, those times in your life where God was present and you did not know it. Sometimes we only see that looking backward. The memory of those times and places will help you build confidence and faith for the wilderness times ahead, which will be inevitable. Jacob said, God is in this place, and I did not know it. Any place or time in our lives can be the gate of heaven when we're walking in faith. May we also look for the God who is standing beside us, even in the darkest wilderness. Amen.